The gravel road stopped answering my phone like a patient who had finally given up. The map pin spun empty as I drove past fields that smelled of old rain and crushed grass, and the gate to the property appeared between two leaning posts as if it had been waiting until I had nowhere left to go. I yanked my duffel from the truck bed, feeling the canvas scrape against my palm, the sun pressing heat into my shoulders, and I walked toward the farmhouse where a man and a woman waited on the porch with faces the color of tobacco and patience. I had taken the job because my bank account sent its own kind of weather. It did not care about plans or tastes. When the woman handed me a folded sheet of paper, the handwriting small and precise, I thought it would be a list of chores. It was a list of rules, each entry paired with a time, an object or action, and an implicit penalty. 2:17 in the morning, a black dog will scratch at the back door. Feed it a can of luncheon meat. 3:03, check the barn. Do not open the inner stall alone. The line of salt must be renewed at dawn and dusk. The first rule looked like humor, then like a superstition, and by the time I put the paper in my coat pocket, I had already decided my ability to obey would be paid in cash, not in understanding. I thought I was taking a temporary job. I did not know I was stepping into a treaty that had been negotiated in fear and ink. My name is Jonah. I had been 23 and 38 resumes long, which is to say I had practiced the economy of small compromises. Back home, I lived in a one-bedroom with a window that looked at a brick wall and a roommate who left for his morning shift before I had made coffee. My degree in environmental studies had become a footnote when bills needed covering. The farm listing said remote, seasonal work, and had attached a small photograph of weathered beams. In college, I had gotten good at reading the moods of people who would be grading me, and at 30, I had learned to read the moods of people who might give me a key. My father had worked with his hands until a bad shoulder made the world of tools a betrayal. He told me once, in a voice that tasted of rust, that responsibility was often a door you could only open from the inside. That sentence had sat with me like a splinter. When Hank and Ruth told me the rules, I heard my father and the faint echo of my own failing bank account. I accepted. I grew up 4 towns over, where summer thunderstorms left the power out for hours and the neighbors came by with flashlights and casseroles. Sometimes we traded jars of pickles for a story or a favor. Those old trades made me suspicious of people selling convenience for silence. Still, the thought of a place to sleep and work for a season felt like a kind of rent paid in days, and I liked being useful in a way my office job had never required. I had rented a pickup, I had packed canned food, rope, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a small packet of sea salt that I thought was ridiculous to bring inland. I kept it in my boot until Ruth told me about the line of salt and the way the wind ate names. The farmhouse smelled like wood smoke and lemon oil. Hank introduced himself with a hand that closed too quickly around mine and a smile that did little work. Ruth stood back, narrow-eyed, and when she finally spoke, it was to direct me into the tasks. "We work with things that need rules," she said, folding the paper and pressing it into my palm, as if to make sure I would carry the weight. Their son, Gabe, a lanky boy with dirt under his fingernails, waved from the porch with the kind of casual hostility young people learn early on countryland. The first hour was a blur of stables and how to lock gates. They taught me how the padlock on the north barn lived by its own rituals, which keys could be turned at which times, and how the chain had to be checked before night, because the chain, they said, sometimes forgot its job. I listened, grateful for any instruction that was specific and repeatable. They handed me a booklet of rules, printed and stapled, not decorative and not open to discussion. Rule 1 through 9, each with an exact minute attached. The rules read like a recipe for denial, a time, an action, a ration. They were numbers and rituals and the kind of certainty I sorely needed. 2:17, feed the dog. 3:03, check the barn. 4:59, ring the bell at the stone gate 3 times. The penalties were never written out. Instead, the margins held notes, small crosses, dates, the initials of people who had tried and failed. Hank said, in a tone that treated the paper like an old contract, "You follow what's on that sheet. People make their living following rules here." Ruth added,
We had 6 helpers before you started this season. Some left, some stayed. Everyone keeps the sheet." I tried to ask what would happen if someone ignored a rule, and they swapped a look, the silence thick like cold metal. And Hank answered with a story about a man who had ignored the bell and was not the same afterward. It was not exactly an explanation. The first 3 days were a blessing of routine. I learned which gates squeaked and which tools warmed in the sun. Mornings tasted like coffee and lint from the wheat sacks.
The cows had names that weren't for me to change. There were calls to nearby towns from Hank that sounded like checks written with gravel, and Ruth timed the meals like a watch. I discovered the comfort of small certainties. Feed at dawn, mend at noon, check the fences at dusk. There was beauty in the ordinary violence of farm work, and I began to let the rules be the scaffolding that held my nerves steady. On the 3rd night, I told myself I would never admit aloud that I was afraid of anything so uncomplicated as a superstition. That night, I set my alarm for 2:15 because I thought it would be funny to beat the ridiculous time printed on the sheet. At 2:17, the sound arrived in the way a memory arrives, sharp, recognizably wrong. It was nails on wood, slow and deliberate, coming from the back door. I sat up as if I had been punched, the mattress sighing small and private under me. The paper had told me, in a single line, to feed a black dog a can of luncheon meat at that hour. I felt foolish. It read like a regional custom meant to test nerves. I walked to the kitchen, the floor cold through my socks, and opened the cabinet where I had put a can of canned meat more out of curiosity than faith. The sound stopped when I placed the open can on the mat below the door. A heavy breath fogged the glass, and a shadow passed without the sound of paws I expected. The dog, when it came into the light, was not a dog I knew. Its ribs showed like a map of trouble, its eyes reflective and too bright. It ate in a way that felt ritualistic, not animal. And when I pushed the can back and shut the door, I understood a word I had been keeping at bay: compliance. That night, the house smelled metallic and of fur, and I slept like someone who had learned a new obligation. Around the time my chest began to unclench and I allowed the rules to teach me ease, I made a small recording for myself, a note I did not plan to share. Keep the salt line intact. Check the padlocks. Ring the bell at midnight if you hear the whistle. The rules were strange. Some were practical, some absurd, all precise, and they came with an expectation that if you cared to keep your nights intact, you respected them without negotiation. There was a rhythm to it that felt like music until the music changed keys in a way you could not predict. I told myself I would follow the rules because the alternative felt like stepping into a dark room with bare feet. The 4th night brought the first time I tested what obedience cost me. At 3:03, the barn door was slightly open, a sliver of black between boards like a mouth I had not noticed. Earlier, the booklet had told me, do not go into the inner stall if you find the barn open. Instead, close the outer door, walk the perimeter, and signal with 3 knocks to the main house. I was alone, the house asleep, and the cold was a live thing crawling under my collar. I shouted hello into the open air, and the barn swallowed my voice with the indifference of old wood. I did what the sheet told me, closing the outer door, walking the fence, and then pounding the wooden siding with my knuckles until my hands ached. No one answered. My phone had no signal. I decided to check the inner stall, and that decision was an act of arrogance. The smell that came from inside the barn hit me first, a metallic scent, like coins boiled in iron. Something moved in the darkness, a shape that was wrong in its animal silence. I fumbled for the flashlight, and my light trembled across a body that was not familiar. Long limbs, folded in ways that objects fold when something else wants to be a shadow. The hay had been disturbed, and on the rake handle something had been carved, an initial I recognized from the margins of the rule sheet. The hair on my arms stood up, and I ran, slamming the outer door and locking it with the same chain that Hank had shown me to loop twice. I banged on the house until Gabe stumbled down in his pajamas, breathless and alert, and Hank came out with a rifle that was heavier than I expected. He said nothing about my disobedience. Ruth's face was white, and she placed her hand on my shoulder with the sort of touch that did not comfort, but transferred a responsibility. "You did what you thought," she said. "Next time, don't." I want to stop here for a second and ask you a question. If you were handed a page of rules tied to a job, and the rules read like a litany of times and small demands, would you follow them or walk away? Type in the comments, "I would follow," or "I would leave," and add one sentence explaining why. Your answers help me understand how people choose when the choice is between a paycheck and a warning. It also helps shape the stories I pick next, because I read what you write when the night gets quiet and the wind presses hard against the old window panes. Think about whether you'd trust a paper over your instinct, and if you think superstition is a tool or a trap. Now, back to the story. After that night, the rules stopped feeling like quaint local color and began to feel like a contract written in listening. I started to learn the signs. The whistle of the wind around the north chimney meant the margin had been checked. A 3-beat knock on the gate meant someone had been near the pasture. A faint humming at dawn meant the line of salt had been walked by an animal or a person. There were others who had worked here before me, and every time their initials appeared in the margins was a small funeral for a lesson. I asked Hank about them directly one afternoon while we were mending a fence. He scratched his jaw and named Lena, Marco, Agnes, Tom, and Victor, each time telling me where they'd gone wrong in terms that were practical. Left a window open, broke the bell protocol, skipped the last salt line, but his eyes said different things. Grief, relief, a kind of economy of blame that made everything small and necessary. Lena had been the last one to leave without notice, and her name was crossed out with a shaky hand. She did what she felt was right, Ruth said, folding the laundry with careful hands. Some choices can't be undone. The first direct proof that the rules had teeth was not an animal. It was a voice. I was in the kitchen counting fence posts by habit because counting calmed me, when I heard my own name in the yard, clear as a bell and the way memory imitates voice. "Jonah, Jonah, come here." It sounded like my mother calling me from a hall I had not walked in years. I opened the back door and the voice was gone, but there were soft prints in the dew that led to the fence and then disappeared. I went looking for a logical explanation, a neighbor's kid, a prank, someone with a radio, but the prints did not belong to any shoe I knew. They were long and narrow. The sensation that had been manageable, like the low hum of a refrigerator, rose into a ringing in my teeth. That night I dreamed of the treaty, a paper with names, hands pressing down, and something paid in silence. I began to suspect the rules were not protective for the people who followed them alone. They were a public ledger that required maintenance. An escalation came when Gabe, who had been generous with his jokes, started to avoid the porch after dusk. One evening I asked him about it while we patched a gate, and he answered with 8 exchanges of clipped dialogue that I remember now for their mounting tension. "You ever hear them sing?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. Gabe hummed once and looked at the sky. "We don't sing, Jonah," he said, "not out here." I pushed. "Why did you leave a lamp on the back fence last week?" He swallowed. "Because my friend thought it would be funny. The lamp burned out at 2:20. The light went like someone snatched it." I asked, "You ever know anyone who didn't come back?" He was quiet. "Tom didn't come back the same. He forgot how to eat." I said, "What do you mean?" He spoke in short bursts now, each phrase a stone. He would sit at the table and stare at the fork. He kept trying to feed the dog with his own hand. Gabe's mouth was dry, and when I offered a practical question, did they call someone, a doctor, the sheriff? He said, "You don't call people for what happens here." The conversation ended with no solution, only the small fact that denial had been worn thin. The barn check had become the ritual that measured nights. One night, when the moon was a shallow coin, I went with Hank and Deputy Cole, a man named Cole who drove down from town when calls were made with the cadenced urgency of men who had sworn to hold together things that wanted to come apart. We spoke in a long scene of 10 exchanges as we worked the metal padlocks and checked the stall doors. The dialogue a map of authority, doubt, and instruction. "Check the padlock," Hank said. "It's on the second loop." "The chain looks chewed," I answered, holding the flashlight steady. Why would anything chew chain? Deputy Cole asked. Because whatever it's become doesn't care for iron the way a fox does, Hank said. It chews at our lines. I laughed too loudly. Lines of salt, Cole said, as if reading an entry. You still lay the line? Hank nodded, and Ruth appeared at the barn with a bucket of new salt. We do what we can, she said. We do it because otherwise it is only a matter of time. Cole tapped his radio and said, record it, write it down, make a note of the times. The exchange ended with the barn door locked and our breaths hanging in the cold. After the barn check, the consequences of a failure were immediate but measured. An animal that refused to enter a stall, a hen with feathers plucked in a pattern like initials, a crop row eaten to stubble overnight in a shape that suggested a message. One morning I found a series of scratches on the back of the silo that looked like tally marks and contained a symbol I had seen in the margins of the rule sheet. My skin prickled, and I tried to measure what could be explained. Raccoons? Storms? A child's prank? The explanations slid off like oil. The rules had an economy, where small violations produced small but brutal returns, like unpaid bills that accrued interest and pain. It was during the 5th week that things began to feel like a test rather than a sequence. Voices started imitating people I loved. Once, in the middle of the night, I heard my father clearly call for his coffee mug the way he used to when he ordered the radio to be on low. The voice came from the shed, and when I opened the door, there was nothing but a mug on the floor. The imitation sounded exactly like him, and my heart moved as if the world had offered me that simple warmth back. I almost stepped forward. Then I remembered Hank's short warning about mimicry. They take the shape of what you miss, he said once, folding his hands on the kitchen counter. You give it a door, and it will come inside. I stayed where I was, and I heard the voice again, this time asking a question my father had never asked. The effect was trembly and cruel. The night felt like someone else was learning the grammar of my life. I started to wonder if obedience to the rules was a battle against a larger grammar that rearranged names for sport. At that point, I sought other voices. I drove, finally, down to the town and talked to Deputy Briggs, an older man with fewer teeth than he had jokes, who kept a notebook on oddities. He told me, over a coffee that tasted like sugar and apology, about a treaty that had been made long before any of our names. This land used to be its own kind of court, he said, tapping his pen. A treaty was made in a language no one uses now. The town signed, farmers agreed, and children were given lists so they would learn obedience. You treat it like weather, and it passes. You do not, and the ledger finds a way to balance. He named names I had seen on the margins, Agnes, Lena, Marco, and told me about a harvest where the corn had grown in patterns so exact a farmer swore the field had been laid out by someone who could read time like a map. I left with a photocopy of an old newspaper clipping and the uncomfortable sense that history was as much a character in this place as any living person. The revelation of the treaty came in fragments and oral histories. We found a rusted ledger in the attic with a faint heading, Agreement between Keepers and Land. It was in a handwriting far older than I expected, and it listed quotas, rituals, and a clause about feeding animals at specified hours. It suggested that the rules were not entirely fearful. They were procedural, like a machinery to be maintained. But the ledger's margins held scribbled notes. Someone had written, in a shaky hand, that the treaty required a keeper, and that the keeper paid in obedience. We are not the makers, Ruth said, as we sat beneath the attic rafters. We are the last ones who remember how to keep the line. Hank's voice was low when he added, It was never meant for people who leave. The more we read, the more the paper began to look like a manual for a machine that used rituals as oil. The machine, though, had teeth and a hunger for negligence. Faced with that knowledge, I had a choice I had been inching toward all along. Run back to the town and town obligations, or stay and accept the responsibility that the ledger suggested. The moral calculus was cheap in public and complicated. If the treaty held as long as someone tended it, what happened to neighbors beyond these fields if someone failed? Who made the call that said, this is enough, We will not keep the line. My father's phrase came back to me. Responsibility was a door you could only open from the inside. I imagined a chain of houses, each with their own pages and rules, a mosaic of small obediences preventing something wider. I thought of the woman in the diner in town who sold pies and told me, when I had asked about the farm, that some bargains you make for other people are about the work of memory. I could leave and return to a life where bills were my only treaty, or I could stay and become a keeper of something that might one day be forgotten if I failed. I chose to stay. That decision required a new apprenticeship. Hank taught me checklists and the cadence of maintenance, like a carpenter teaches the order of nails and boards. We made procedural lists I could follow even with sleep eating my edges. The line of salt was refreshed at dawn and dusk. Walk east to the hollow, pour a slow ribbon of salt 5 paces, press it flat with your shoe, count to 13, then walk back. The barn check procedure was a sequence. Approach the outer door, count 3 if the door is ajar, lock the outer door, walk the perimeter, call for backup on the radio. The radio protocol itself was written down. Code 1 for animal breach, Code 2 for mimicry, Code 3 for human confusion, and the siren of our community was the bell by the gate, which must be rung 3 times before midnight if any howl is heard. I made a list of the supplies we needed and where to put them. Cans of luncheon meat kept in a tin by the back door, spare batteries in a tin over the stove, a padlock with 2 keys, one kept on my person and one in Ruth's apron pocket. We practiced the steps until they felt like muscle memory. Each process description was precise. Check the line of salt for breaks. If a break is found, flush it with fresh salt and mark the location in the ledger. If a mimicry voice asks you for something that is time-bound, do not respond to its request. Instead, call out the person's name 3 times and verify with someone else. These were not arbitrary rules. They were playbooks for a small war. We trained the emotional muscles too. Ruth taught me to name things when they happened instead of letting them loop unnamed inside you. If you heard your mother's voice calling from the field, you would respond out loud, "This is Jonah, who are you?" and then loop back to the rules. We practiced the scripts for when a neighbor appeared at the gate in a state of confusion. Do not invite them in, do not give personal details, and ring the bell to signal for counsel. The training included moral drills, what to do if an attempt to lure a keeper away occurred, how to manage a child who claimed they had heard a chorus from the corn, and how to file reports in the ledger when a rule had been incorrectly followed. There was a ritual checklist we taped to the inside of the pantry door that listed the sequence in 280 words, and we read it every dawn. The process descriptions were small but sturdy, 250 to 350 characters each, like instructions carved into a tool handle. The nights grew more crowded as I learned to listen not for the absence of noise, but for the shape of it. There were moments of tension that sharpened the edges of what we were willing to risk. The first was the night the dog did not want the can and thumped at the door with a desperation that made the wood complain. My description must be precise. The nails raked at the wood for 7 long beats. The metallic smell pooled in the kitchen, and when the can was refused, the creature sat on the porch and howled in a voice that sounded like a chorus being folded into glue. I could not sleep for hours after that. Another time, a figure stood in the cornfield at 3 in the morning and hummed the exact lullaby my mother used to sing. When I approached, the figure vanished into a geometry of cornstalks and left a single shoe on the ground, wet with dew and smelling faintly of onions. The third moment involved a neighbor, Marco, who returned from town with his mind thin and empty. He stood at my kitchen table and tried to tell me the way clocks tasted. He left the next day, and his name was one of the ones crossed violently in the ledger. Each of these moments demanded a paragraph of attention because they were the nights where we counted cost. One particular moment stretched for a long, slow paragraph. We were on the edge of a thunderstorm, and the barn bell had rung on its own at 5:15, a stubborn, human-sounding thing at the edge of my hearing. Hank and I went out with lanterns and a shovel and the radio between us. The path to the barn smelled of iron and cut hay.
There were scratches on the back door like the alphabet of a hand too big for a glove. We exchanged 8 sentences that sounded small and tired. "Keep the light low," Hank said. "If it wants to see itself, let it," I answered. "Lock the south hinge," he ordered. "I did," I said. "Padlock?" he asked. "On me," I replied. "Check your breath," he said. "What?" I laughed, weak. He answered, "Listen for air that is not yours." That sequence felt like an exam. We finished the
Check, and the bell stopped ringing. The barn door had been closed from the inside. The ledger later had a note, 5:15, bell. The timestamp became a loop in my head. As the stakes rose, so did the manipulations. Voices began calling people who were not in their graves by name, and asking for things only they would ask. The mimicry could be specific. It could recite a fragment of your childhood and then ask for a small favor, and when you refused, it escalated to beggary. It imitated hunger in a way that pried at conscience. One night I heard my mother ask me to pass her the salt, and when I refused, the voice sharpened and called me a coward. I walked away, and I carried that adjective like a bruise for days. The psychological pressure was a tool. It wore you down. The only real protection was the ledger and the people who still remembered how to enforce it. We tried to widen the fence of safety by bringing other people into the ritual. I enlisted Maria from the next farm to help with the salt line on the south edge, and we practiced the steps together. Deputy Cole would call in at scheduled times, and we practiced radio codes until they sang as a rhythm. We named a backup keeper in town, Pastor Sam, who agreed to meet on the first of each month to review the ledger. Each time a name joined the loop, Lena, Marco, Agnes, Tom, Victor, Gabe, Maria, Deputy Cole, the system felt less like a single person's burden and more like a communal maintenance. We also cataloged failures. Lena had once left in the middle of the night shouting. Marco had stopped eating at the table. Tom had been found staring at his hands. Victor had vanished for a week and returned thinner, his voice wrong. Each story hardened into a lesson carved in the margins. When a breach happened, we worked like surgeons in the dark. The procedure for a breach was exact. First, contain the space by closing doors and laying fresh salt. Second, check for mimicry and call 2 witnesses. Third, do a barn check and record every oddity in the ledger. Fourth, perform a small ritual that might look superstitious. Ring the bell, pour water in a line, and sing a short cadence from an old church hymn that Pastor Sam had taught us. And finally, if a physical injury had been caused, call Deputy Cole and document the event. Each step was 250 to 350 characters in my head when I tried to teach it to Gabe, so I made it a printed note and put it in the kitchen drawer. The steps felt ritual and clinical at once, and they required cooperation and a will to keep doing small things no one would notice unless they were no longer done. The night before the final confrontation was the one I remember with the clarity of glass. The sky was iron dark, the wind moving in slow ropes across the field. We had seen a pattern. The mimicry had grown bolder. The barn checks had become irregular, and the ledger's margins were full of dates. That night, the bell at the gate rang a single time at 3:05, a flat, human sound. I woke and put on my boots. Ruth handed me a tin of food and a rope and said, "If you go out there, remember to speak the names." By then, I had learned how powerful names were. Hank drove us in the truck with the headlights off, the radio silent. We moved like people on a mission to fix a leak. In the field, the thing formed from the air itself, a suggestion first and then limbs. It came at us in the shape of a man, with a child's collar and an old man's gait. And it spoke first in Gabe's voice, then in Lena's, then in something that scraped the marrow. The dialogue that followed between the 4 of us and the thing was a long exchange of strategy, heartbreak, and refusal. "You will let us in," it said in a chorus of our missing. "We belonged here first." "No," Hank replied, steady and low. "This agreement kept us safe." "Safe for whom?" it answered, and when it mimicked the voice of someone I loved, I nearly gave ground. Ruth stepped forward then and began to read aloud the ledger. We chanted in a crooked sync, throwing names like talismans. The thing recoiled when the words landed, as if they had weight. It tried to bargain, trade one life for another. We refused. The battle was not loud so much as persistent. In the end, we managed to seal the barn, reinforce the line of salt, and the creature dissolved like fog under the sun. We were exhausted and raw, but the ledger had held because people had done their jobs. The immediate consequence was small and human. The next morning, the town listed a minor shortage at the co-op, and 3 dairy cows had to be put down because they would not eat. We recorded every loss in the ledger. People in nearby houses left candles at their porches for a week, a gesture that read like solidarity. The sheriff drove by, slowing to look at our faces, and Deputy Cole wrote down the events in his notebook in a way that made it clear this would be something the town remembered. We had been tested and we had passed, because we had worked the machinery of ritual with enough precision to hold it together. 1 month later, the property had a new rhythm. The ledger had thicker entries and fewer margins. We had added names to the roster, and training was more routine. I still woke at odd times, but fewer voices called with the sweet cruelty of memory. The farm smelled like cut hay and salt, and the metal of good tools. The community reaction was practical. More people from the town volunteered to rotate night checks. Pastor Sam held a meeting that was part prayer, part instruction, and the town paper ran a short piece about the unusual maintenance required by the old agreements. There was a small public debate at the diner. Some thought we should publish the rules and invite inspection. Others said certain knowledge needed to be kept close. Ruth and Hank refused to make it spectacle. They said we were keepers, not preachers. I found myself writing shorter entries in a ledger that once had been foreign to me, adding my initials beside my first proper scare, the dog that refused to eat. 3 months later, the cost had become clear in ways that the ledger could not entirely hold. Marco, who had helped twice that month, left in the night with a sack and never returned to the farm as a worker. He came back to town and found work at the mill and spoke rarely, his voice thin. And when he did, he described the nights as if they were weather. Gabe stayed on, but his humor was a notch more brittle. The town's children learned to ask about the bell on school tours like it was an oddity in the curriculum. People left jars of salt at our gate and called them tokens. There were fewer mimicry incidents, but the ledger's pages still had fresh ink. The crack in the social world around us had been mended by attention, but the cost of attention is a kind of tiredness that stacks beneath the eyes. 6 months after I first drove down that gravel road, the ledger had a new set of signatures. The ritual had been taught to 3 more people, including Maria and Deputy Cole, who now checked in with a cadence that sounded like devotion. I had learned to move through the house and the outbuildings with a set of bodily memories. Where to step to avoid a creak that summoned echoes, how to place a can of luncheon meat with care, the exact pressure to use when laying a salt line so it would hold through rain. The community had settled into a new contract. We would teach the rules to willing keepers and accept the echoes of history as part of our economy. Some people left, others stayed. I did not know if anything like peace had been achieved. What I knew, with the slow certainty of scars, is that the ledger continued because people chose to keep it. A treaty, no matter how old, is a machine that needs maintenance by hands that remember. The final image I want you to hold is small. A door with a padlock, a thin line of salt by the threshold, and a tin on the step with a half-empty can of luncheon meat. Those are the mundane anchors of an odd covenant. I still wake sometimes and hear a voice. That used to be home. I answer aloud and then check the ledger, and I write the time down. I became a keeper because someone had to be, because people in town who had once been named in margins trusted us to remember. The choice was not heroic. It was a sequence of small obediences, the kind that add up over months until they form a fence. If you liked this account and want to see more reconstructions like it, subscribe. I retell these events with as much care as possible, interviews, copies of old documents, and a listening ear for the small details that matter. Subscribing helps me keep traveling to places that still run on paper and ritual, and it helps me bring you more stories that test how far the ordinary holds. If you want deeper investigation into the documents I found, or to hear interviews with Hank, Ruth, Gabe, Deputy Cole, Maria, and Pastor Sam, let me know in the comments. Your engagement helps me decide where to go next and which quiet voices need a listener. For now, I keep the line of salt, and there is comfort in the rhythm even when the reason is only a ledger and the memory of those who taught me how to obey. I do not tell this as a triumph. I tell it as a responsibility I accepted and was changed by. I lost sleep and learned phrases I never expected to learn. I gained a kind of housekeeping knowledge that is its own kind of authority. The town seemed to breathe easier. Some neighbors lit lamps on certain nights. The ledger sits now under a weight of new signatures, and when I run my finger along the dates, I can see the arc of small survivals, each one an entry in a book that prefers ink to forgetting. I do not know how long the treaty will hold. That is the one thing that remains unsettled, like a kettle that will sing when left a little too long over heat. But for now, at least, the barn is closed, the padlock hangs where it should, and the bell is only rung with care. If you were there, which rule would have felt impossible for you to follow? Tell me in the comments which line you would break first and why. Your answers shape the next trip I take. Some treaties survive because someone decides they will carry the ledger. Others dissolve when people prefer the illusion of freedom to the hard work of keeping something whole. Remember the padlock, the line of salt, the can on the step. Some agreements are only maintained by the people who show up at odd hours and do the small things no one notices until they are not done. There is a sound I still listen for, a slow creak in the floor, like a page turning, and sometimes, at 2:17 in the morning, I set the can out anyway. Not because I believe in magic, but because I believe in the work that comes after fear. The work keeps us from becoming the sort of people who forget their neighbors. It is not a story with a tidy ending. It is a ledger with pages to add. And my name is there now, in ink that might smear, but which, for as long as I am willing to keep it, holds a neighborhood together.